a sense of hopelessness. And in that sense of hopelessness, people are desperate and are looking for kind of a fast, quick relief. And so they turn to those with large personalities, right? Those who give the answers to society problems, like some simple solutions, like, I don't know, building a wall, or perhaps even like waging an abstract war against drugs, for example, right? And so the people turn to these people because they're charismatic, and they say, hey, I have a solution to your problems. And that's how we got this guy, this wonderful guy who made all these promises for nothing, right? So it's in this context that heightened attacks happen on the Filipino people. The presentation's objective is to not only show you the urgency of the situation in the Philippines, but to also kind of highlight the fearless resistance that's being waged by the Filipino people and the need for us to support them in solidarity.
I added another quote here because not only is Duterte extremely fascist in broad society, but he has reached this next level of what we call macho fascism, where his words are really systematizing and supporting violence against women. So this was a quote from him before he got elected. I was angry that she was raped. Yes, that was one thing, but she was so beautiful. I think the mayor should have been first. What a waste. And this was in the context of a prison riot that happened in an Australian nun or missionary was kidnapped by the population and then was raped and killed. So this was a comment about wishing that he had his opportunity. And then one more is, tell the soldiers there's a new order coming from the mayor. We won't kill you. We will just shoot you in the vagina. So this is talking about the armed insurgency that's happening in the Philippines. So women who are waging revolutionary struggle, in order to defeat them, it's better to just make them useless, because without their vagina and reproductive abilities, that means that they're useless as human beings. So instead of killing them, shoot them in the vagina. So these are orders he gave to the armed forces of the Philippines. And when he's the highest elected in all of the land, so if he says comments like this, of course, it's going to become policy directives, not just jokes or harmful jokes or meaningless jokes.
So the war on the poor. Is this me? Okay. So Duterte's war on drugs is actually really the war on the poor. So after 2 years of a failed drug war, meth or shabu is cheaper and more accessible than ever. Prices have dropped by 70%. Drug lords in government positions get promotions instead of being held accountable for allowing drugs into and throughout the country. Duterte hands over control of the Bureau of Customs to the Armed Forces of the Philippines, or the AFP, right, the expression of martial law, thus giving the AFP the oversight of drug smuggling. And 2 tons of drugs have been publicly exposed and kind of kept, right? So the AFP themselves are a corrupt agency directly linked to drug trafficking. And at what cost? Over 23,000 killings, mostly of the urban poor. And to give kind of the number and context for us in the DC area, that's like having all the Filipinos in DC killed 5 times over. So there's about 4,000 in DC. That's like having 5 times of them, right, killed.
If you've been to New York City, Barclays Center, if you filled all of Barclays Center, that's the amount of bodies that have been killed in the drug war.
Right, and I think that when you get numbers that high, it starts to kind of just sound like numbers, but these are actually people. And there's PMP corruption against women, right? Rape against women. Yeah, there you go.
I'm just adding to some, this was a picture taken by Rafi Lerma, and this is a common occurrence on the street. You'll see bodies that are dropped. It'll say pusher ako or drug dealer ako, or really there's no due process, right? Like what Arnel was saying, it's the police in collusion with vigilantes who are also paid off to do the police's bidding in the drug war. And it's mostly in the urban poor communities. So when we think about drugs instead of being really punitive and killing or imprisoning, to solve the drug crisis is really to solve the economic crisis, to provide jobs, to provide actual rehabilitation for drug users, not to just like summarily execute them on the street. And a lot of people get caught in the crossfires, even children. These are some of the youngest victims in Duterte's drug war. Danica May Garcia was 5, Althea Bardon, Sanino Batucan, Francis Manosco. A lot of them were in their family store at the time when they were with a suspect. So either the father was a suspected drug user. I think Danica May was the one who was on a motorcycle, and they call it riding in tandem when people execute somebody from a motorcycle. So a masked assailant is on a motorcycle, and then they execute a suspect of the drug war. So the bullet actually went through the father into the daughter. And then one of the other kids was just like in the Sari Sari store, and the police opened fire and the bullets went through the walls, and then instead of killing him, it killed the daughter. So Duterte has often said that, of course, there's going to be young victims. This is just collateral damage in the drug war. But these are real people and real families that are torn apart by what's happening back home. And these are some facts too about state violence against women and how the police play a role into this. So some facts are 56 cops are involved in 33 state-perpetuated cases of violence against women, monitored since Duterte became president. 16 out of the 33 cases involve rape. 13 cases involve victims who are 17 years old and below, and 12 cases are drug-related, meaning the victims were either drug suspects, relatives of drug suspects, or were assaulted during drug-related operations. In one case, a young teenager, in order to get her father out of being arrested, was forced to sell her body. So that's also one instance that we're seeing in this drug war of how women's bodies and children are being violated in the drug war.
But even if wasn't that I don't know, the perpetrator, right? He said that this is nothing new,
Yeah.
right? This is nothing new when we hold people.
Mm-hmm.
This is kind of their standard operating procedure.
And it also affects our diaspora. Like, why should we care too? A lot of, every single day, 7,000 plus Filipinos leave the Philippines in search of work abroad. Like, raise your hand if you have family in the Middle East. Is anybody? Middle East, Canada. Yeah, we're all over. Filipinos are all over the world. So, and that's because there's no jobs at home. When you think about our parents or why we personally migrated, it's for a better life for our family, our kids, right, mom and dad? Like, it wasn't really like you wanted to leave your family behind. So in this case, an OFW, overseas Filipino worker, their family member was killed. They had to beg their employer to be able to go home, and because they weren't allowed, they had to FaceTime or video chat for the funeral. And this is really what we're feeling, the impacts. Mothers who go home to work and provide for their family, they're coming home to dead bodies. And what else did I want to say about this? And even in the diaspora, like in New York City, we do a lot of work with detainee support at Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And we've actually been able to get asylum for some victims because they were arrested for drug charges in New York City or New Jersey. We got an asylum case because if they were sent home, then they would probably be executed or be one of the big targets in the drug war. So it was actually a big victory that we won up north. And one more case we did want to cover is Kian de los Santos. We want to talk about Kian. And then one more, Kian de los Santos, he was 17 years old. And there's CCTV footage, you can find this case on the internet. And he was targeted by the police, and he was killed because he was accused of being a drug runner, drug pusher, but he, in the video, is very clearly saying, Kuya, no, like I have school tomorrow, I have an exam, like stop it, can I just go home, etc., etc., and then he was killed. So as young as 5 years old, teenagers, women, children, a lot of people are being caught up in the drug war.
And along with that is also the war on the landless and the rural poor. It got kind of cut off right there. But it says, on the top, it's supposed to say the war on the landless and rural poor and stop killing farmers. So the Sagay 9 massacre, on October 20th, 9 sugarcane farm workers were members of the National Federation of Sugarcane Workers, were harvesting food and resting in the little makeshift shelter when 40 armed men against these 9, okay, unleashed bullets and killed them. 2 of which were youth, and 3 were women who were trying to escape and were burned. The sugarcane farm workers were just practicing collective farming, and they were farming on idle lands during the season, during the off season, in order to feed themselves and their family. And the government, right, when they had heard about these killings, they had accused first the NPA, the New People's Army, of killing them, and then later changed the story and said, no, they themselves were members of the NPA. And so for those of you who aren't necessarily familiar with the NPA, they're essentially a peasant army in a civil war, right, where the government rules pretty much most of the big landlords, right, the big landlords. And so the civilian army, or the New People's Army, are there to kind of defend kind of just the basic civilians, right? And then this is an excuse that's often used to criminalize the New People's Army and to blame it on them when their story is already kind of a little wishy-washy. They're not quite clear on how that happened. But later on, a human rights fact-finding mission later revealed that the perpetrators were a trained private army of a big hacienda landowner and trained members of a special civilian auxiliary army force of the armed forces of the Philippines. So clearly we're finding that there's a lot of discrepancies in these stories. And here, you'll see the large land holdings amid peasant landlessness. It's a little fine for you to see here, but if I can just kind of highlight, in the green areas are the haciendas, the blue are the plantations, and this kind of burgundy color are the claimed by landlords, corruptions, and institutions. The aspiration of land is one that still obviously goes unanswered in the Philippines. This is significant given that 75% of the population still live in the countryside and whose economic activity is tied directly to the land. And you find that there's a certain area particularly, right, like that there are land grabbings and there's plantations particularly, right, in the Mindanao area. Does that look maybe like a potential reason why they might send folks down there, right? Where did I live off? Okay, so 75% of the population still live in the countryside and whose economic activity is tied to the land. Land conversions, the average of 165,000 hectares of irrigated prime agricultural lands are converted to other uses annually, based on what's reported by the National Irrigation Administration. And we know that the Philippines has lost 93.4% of extracted mineral wealth to foreign big mines over the past 20 years. Again, let me say that one more time. The Philippines has lost 93.4% of extracted mineral wealth to foreign big mines over the past 20 years. Okay, so if you see all the wealth of resources, right, a big way that you're able to kind of monopolize that is by gaining control, militarized control of the area, right?
Yeah, in Mindanao and in the Philippines in general, there's so much mineral wealth. There's gold, there's copper, there's silver, there's uranium, and it's so fertile down there. So like my mom's from the Visayas region, and that's where like a lot of the typhoons come in. That's where Typhoon Haiyan hit, but in Mindanao in particular, it doesn't get hit by typhoons so often. So it's like so fertile. It's called the breadbasket of the Philippines. So majority of the food grown in the Philippines is also grown in Mindanao.
So here you see that the people in the cities aren't necessarily faring any better, right? These are long lines for lower priced rice from the National Food Authority in Cebu City. Okay. As far as contractualization, or what ENDO, or the end of contract, right, is the legal process of hiring fixed income or fixed term employees and continuously renewing their contracts so that you don't have to give them the benefits that normal employees are entitled to. So one of the campaign promises was that he was going to end or end ENDO, right? It was stop contractualization. And he ends up, obviously, reneging on that promise. Okay? The end result is that workers are organizing and launching strikes. So these are some of the multinational corporations where workers and laborers are waging strikes. You may know some of this for the vinegar and the fruits and the little spices and stuff like that. Yeah, but these...
Right. And the ketchup.
Yeah, the ketchup,
everything
right?
that we cook with in our, in our kitchen cabinets. Every day. That's NutriAsia. And then just a little bit about NutriAsia. This was coming up about in
the next one.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
So the NutriAsia company. A lot of the workers, they're the ones who are packaging all of these sauces that we find in our kitchens. They're packaging them at temperatures that are like 200 degrees, and they're not having proper safety equipment, not proper gloves. A lot of them are like get burns, but they continue working because they need these jobs. Also, they're getting paid less than $6 a day for like sometimes 16-hour shifts. And a lot of the majority of them are contractualized, just what Risa was saying. So that means like you work for like 5 months at a time, and then your contract ends, and you may or may not be able to get another job, or you wait another time, and then you just keep renewing contracts so that you don't have any benefits in the workplace. You don't have the rights to unionize. So a lot of protests recently happened to protest all of these terrible working place conditions. And it was super policed and militarized. This is a picture from the violent dispersals that happened. Private guards, the police would break up these protests. Here in the bottom right, you see someone with a gun. This is Nairita. She was bloodied and beaten because she was protesting by the police.
Right, so that's the government's response, right? So there's unfair working conditions, the people protest, right? They strike, and the response to the government is to violently repress by attacking picket lines and to jail labor organizers or leaders. Okay, so after unilaterally canceling, ending the peace talks with the National Democratic Front of the Philippines, Duterte turned to an all-out war strategy. He declared CPP and NPA terrorists and is coming up with a list of terrorists to target. There are 600 members on this list, including environmental activists, the indigenous leaders, particularly from the Cordillera People's Alliance, the North Philippines to the Lumad indigenous people in the southern Philippines, and even the United Nations Special Rapporteur on International People's Rights was listed. And just to kind of know, just so that you know how arbitrary this list is, they've even kind of included Jane Doe placeholders. So if they happen to take someone, right, they can always justify saying, no, they were on the list under Jane Doe or John Doe. So again, these are just kind of arbitrary lists of people on this terrorist list.
And these lists are very dangerous because they actually become like hit lists.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. In the context of the Philippines,
Yes.
where there's the law isn't really abided by.
Okay, and I think this kind of speaks for itself. So there's over 500 political prisoners today. Actually, I think there might be more because this is as of November, about a month off. But yeah, there's over 500 political prisoners today. Okay. This is Ben Ramos. He was 56 years old and was a founding member of the National Union of People's Lawyers. Despite limitations, he was the kind of go-to pro bono lawyer for the peasants, for environmentalists, for activists, political prisoners, and mass organizations in the Negros Occidental. Earlier this year, he was maliciously and irresponsibly targeted in a public poster by the Philippine police as among the so-called personalities of the underground armed movement. And as soon as he was put on that list, he had got a text that said he was on the list, and Ben is the 34th lawyer that's been killed over the 2-year administration of President Duterte. And he was the lawyer for, if you remember the Sagay 9, he was the lawyer that represented them. And so Duterte forms death squads against the New People Army city-based units. And this will include targeting loiterers, okay, who could be considered as potential recruitments for the NPA. So there's no real credibility there, right? It says that, he's going to identify who NPA is, and that he's going to, but again, there's absolutely no credibility to who he is targeting. And it's a continuing pattern to whip up fear that would justify declaring martial law and trying to normalize the idea of kind of more fascist tactics.
So one of the groups,
Sorry.
Musical chair.
So in addition to targeting the rural poor, the urban poor, the landless, there's also been a targeting of indigenous communities, particularly in areas where they are sitting on fertile land that is rich in minerals, as Julie had alluded to earlier. And one specific indigenous group that has been heavily targeted is the Lumads. They are based in Mindanao. But the Lumad community has been able to self-sustain itself because sometimes the government, or most of the time the Philippine government, does not provide any resources for educating the community in the region. So the Lumads created their own schools. They call it alternative schools. They call it Alcadet, correct?
That's one of them.
It's one of the schools that were created by the Lumad community. And unfortunately, these schools have been under attack because the AFP, the Armed Filipino Forces of the Philippines, accuses these schools of recruiting folks to join the New People's Army, which is totally untrue.
Yeah, Duterte has also said he'll bomb Lumad schools. And these are really, later on I'll talk about my integration, exposure trip, integrating with Lumad communities. And they're so important because they're really sandwiched like so deep in the mountains, on their ancestral lands. So to make the journey and the trek down to the city, it would take you a week or 4 days, sometimes by foot. And for indigenous communities, a lot of the education isn't culturally relevant to them. So a lot of what they learn in these schools is about their human rights. It's about how to protect the land, how to grow food, how to be caretakers of the land. Because the Lumads say that land is life for them. It's where they go to the grocery store. It's where they find their medicine. It's where they find shelter, and where they can use materials to build their shelters.
Yeah, so just a couple quick facts regarding the attacks that's been happening on the Lumad schools in Mindanao from July 2016 to April 2018. The numbers speak for itself. 134 schools have been affected. 56 schools have been forcibly closed. Students affected by the closure have been about 2,209. And teachers at these schools and as well as students have also been killed. So there have been 9 related school deaths. Students affected by being displaced as a result of the targeted killings. 2,787, and teachers who have been accused of trying to recruit so-called students into the MPA, 15.
Sometimes they like to slap on like kidnapping charges, like, oh, I kidnapped my students, so that's what a trumped-up charge can look like in the Philippines.
So, martial law.
Okay, yeah. So, as we know, martial law is the imposition of direct military control of kind of normal civilian life and normal civilian functions of government, especially in response to a temporary emergency, right? Such as an invasion, a disaster, or occupied territory. So, when one thinks of kind of fascism, right, martial law is kind of the gold standard. That's your ultimate military control over civilian life, right? It's easy solutions. For the fascists, it cures all their solutions. For legal obstacles, right, like, I don't know, due process, human rights, accountability to the civilian population, and basic transparency for both its own constituencies, its own citizens, as well as internationally, right? Okay, so here is a poster of the dues of martial law for PMP personnel put out by Duterte's administration, right? And despite the 14 years of experience with martial law under the US-backed Marcos dictatorship, you would have thought that they would never return to a military state over civilian life, right? But as you can see in this poster, with this rules outlined for PNP personnel, Duterte's administration has done its job to sanitize martial law, right? One, shall at all times respect the human rights and dignity of the suspect. Two, shall strictly observe the police operational procedure. Three, shall stringently follow the provisions of Republic Act number 7438, rights of arrested detained persons. And four, shall strictly obey the provisions of Republic Act number 9745, anti-torture law, right? So, for propaganda, this looks good, right? Like, if you can actually do these things, maybe martial law is not so bad. Look, they're not supposed to do any of these things, right? So that just kind of shows you that they've done such a great job with making martial law seem acceptable through propaganda. That so much so that Marcos's time is referred to as the golden years. So if we think about that, acceptance of martial law only makes it easier to for the state to justify and rationalize its terror, right? If police and state forces already operate with a culture of impunity under civilian government, imagine the horrors that can and have been unleashed when Duterte could officially give his heavily armed military impunity through martial law, especially when there's like no consequence, right? No direct consequence. So why was martial law declared for the whole island of Mindanao, right? So supposedly it was to crush an ISIS group located right here in this little pin drop, right? So they were known as the Maute, whose presence was limited to Marawi City, okay? But why is it then that after 5 months of aerial bombings, which completely demolished the city and displaced most of the entire population, does martial law extend until the end of 2018? Actually, the latest news has extended martial law to the end of 2019, right? So on May 23rd, 2017, Duterte declared martial law in Mindanao. But de facto, it's actually enforced nationwide, right? Via checkpoints, illegal arrests, and aerial strikes, right? That's how they justify it.
So what has martial law meant for 25.53 million people? This is the latest,
Yeah,
most up-to-date
nice.
far as between 2017, since it's been implemented in Mindanao, to right now. So there have been 88 political killings. There have been 1,450 illegal arrests. There have been 148 cases with those that have been threatened with trumped-up charges. And with the continuous bombings in the region, those that have been affected have been about 346,940 people. And obviously this data doesn't include the drug-related extrajudicial killings that's also taking place.
Okay, so this is a shot of Marawi. So after destroying Marawi, it was discovered that the plans to rebuild the city were actually to build a military camp or making it a prime tourist destination. So it's clear, right, that it was not necessarily intended for the people who live there, right? What is to happen to the residents now that they were forced to evacuate, right? So if we think about it, with all the international military aid they're receiving and profits from tourists and international investors, it's more profitable for them to displace the oppressed peoples or the native peoples, right? And then just say, you know what, now we're building a military camp and tourist destinations, because then they continually get that money, right? Continually get that kickback. So there's no real reason for them to be accountable. But it's demolished, and the plans aren't for the people, it's for more foreign investment.
I just want to add something too. I went to Marawi in 2010, and it was such a beautiful city. It's known as the Islamic city of Muslim Mindanao. And now it really looks like Syria or some bombed out place in the Middle East. And over 400,000 Moro, or like the Muslim Filipinos, who are also indigenous to the Philippines, their communities, they were located here, are still displaced till this day because they cannot return. There's a military occupation there. There's so many bids to make this into like the next tourist destination. And that includes, most of the bids are Chinese companies, and it's mostly, it's probably, those are the people who are going to profit from rebuilding Marawi City. And it's a concept, I know some people hear it, it's being floated around, called disaster capitalism. So it's really like getting that blank slate to do whatever you want and to make the most money out of it. You know, we see it in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. We've seen it in New Orleans after you know, the big Hurricane Katrina. So just like seeing like how all of this is connected, it's really for profit, not for the people who are there, and who rightfully should be able to return.
So I'll ask again, why declare martial law in the entire islands of Mindanao, right? Economic opportunities for big foreign businesses. So let's explore the significance of the island. It is estimated that Mindanao has $1 trillion in mineral wealth, okay, according to WikiLeaks. These are according to WikiLeaks. $1 trillion worth in mineral wealth. So it's interesting to note that many of the deposits also happen to be found under the ancestral lands of the indigenous peoples, or the Lumans. And it's estimated that 93% of the mineral wealth of the Philippines has been taken by foreign mining corporations over the past 20 years. And also, this is also the area where large oil and gas deposits are found. And there is a definition of fascism that I believe kind of hits the heart of what's happening in Mindanao, and says, fascism is the dictatorship of the most reactionary section of the big monopoly capitalists. So basically, it's a way for the 1% to protect its economic interests, right, in an ever-growing kind of unstable environment caused by this economic crisis. And so they want to pursue more profits for the few as opposed to the needs of the many. And so, in other words, it's pretty much open warfare against the poor, which we know in the Philippines is the majority of the people.
The issue of land really comes into play. You know, with the land grabbing that she was talking about earlier, There's Dole, and there's like a huge Dole banana plantation in Mindanao. There's palm oil plantations, pineapple plantations, and all of these companies aren't Filipino owned. So, and when it comes to extracting the resources too, the Philippines isn't industrialized. So it's really like Australian companies, Chinese, American, Japanese that come in, extract the resources, ship them abroad, process it there, and then resell it back to us, finished products back to the Philippines. So the Filipinos are really losing the economic power by not having these national industries. It's going into the hands of foreign, multinational foreign corporations, or the 1% in the Filipino society.
So one factor that's playing into the operations, the military operations in the Philippines, the AFP, the Philippine National Police, in conducting these wars on the poor, the landless, the indigenous community, is the USAID funding from the United States government. In early 2016, it was announced that the Philippines received more than $120 million in military aid, particularly, almost doubling the amount that Washington normally extends each year. If you take a look at the breakdown of the financing, $79 million in 2016 went towards traditional military aid, and $42 million coming from the new U.S. South Asia Maritime Initiative. This money was used to purchase military equipment. Also, $1 billion of military equipment was purchased, 2 U.S. Coast Guard cutters, 12 FA-50 light fighter jets. And in addition to that, we still have U.S. military occupation in Antonio Bautista Air Base, Basa Air Base, Fort Magsaysay, Lumbia Air Base, and Mactan Benito Uben Air Base. I apologize if I mispronounced those. But currently, for 2018, $184 million of our tax dollars are going towards the Philippine military and national police. In addition to that, the United States has also been funding Operation Pacific Eagle. It's a contingency operation in the Philippines, supposedly to battle extremist terrorists in Mindanao. In 2019, President Obama rebranded the global war on terror as Overseas Contingency Operations. The Overseas Contingency Operation designated evolved out of an emergency defense spending option. The Budget Control Act of 2011 in the United States added the designation of Overseas Contingency Operation, also known as the Global War on Terror, to existing emergency exemption, providing Congress and the President with an alternate way to exclude military funding from the spending limits. So in essence, the Overseas Contingency Operation is basically a Pentagon slush fund. So unregulated money is used to support or fund the support of wars and human rights violations happening in the Philippines, also happening in the Middle East like Iraq and Syria.
And just to add, Operation Pacific Eagle, so that really came after the Marawi siege and grouped the counterterrorism efforts in Southeast Asia that are happening with Iraq and Syria. And 184.5 million of our U.S. tax dollars, that's a huge chunk, that can really go to funding, building roads, accessible education, just a whole slew of things. There's so many homeless people in our communities. So just thinking of what that tax dollars can actually go towards. And we have a long history with the United States. I know there's a lot of Fonz people here, but the military has been a really big part of our history and occupying the Philippines. So just pop quiz question. In the Philippine-American War, how many Filipinos died during the American occupation? Anybody know? Estimates?
200,000?
Yeah, that's the low. Yeah, it's actually the low ball. But some people estimate it to be up to 1 million deaths during the Philippine-American War. We've had bases, U.S. military bases were kicked out in 1992, but we still have all these agreements, like the Visiting Forces Agreements, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreements, which allows U.S. military troops to be in the Philippines for rest recreation, for storing equipment and weapons, for doing like balikitan exercises, so training the Philippine military there on the ground through joint exercises. And this also increases violence against women. Anytime there's a military base in the Philippines, there's an increase of rape, of sexual harassment, like in the case of Jennifer Laude. Has anyone heard about Jennifer Laude? Raise your hand. Yeah, Jennifer Laude was killed in 2014 by a U.S. Marine who was 19, Joseph Scott Pemberton, and this was nowhere in the news. So she was a trans Filipina who was with Joseph Scott Pemberton, and when he realized that she was trans, he strangled her and left her for dead in a toilet bowl. And the Visiting Forces Agreement deems that unless a crime is committed by the U.S. military, if it's of national interest to the Philippines, they won't pursue the case. So this is one of the only cases where a U.S. Marine, a U.S. Personnel was charged of a crime against the Filipino people, but of a lesser charge than murder. But all that to say is that there's a huge military presence in the Philippines from the United States, and we sent a lot of our tax dollars. So as we're seeing like all these human rights violations happening, it is our right, and this is where we're really connected to the struggle of what's happening in the Philippines. It is our right to demand, like, what is going on with all these human rights violations? What is happening in the drug war? Why are all these people being tortured and detained and kicked off their land and murdered for standing up for their rights? So as Filipinos in the diaspora, as migrant communities here, whose families are still back home, we should really put pressure on the U.S. government to ask those questions, to hold investigations, to hold legislative action or trials, to figure out what's happening so that we know that our tax dollars aren't going to killing our kababayans back home.
So despite the U.S.-backed Duterte regime, despite their efforts to try and quell dissent, the people have not been silenced. They continue to resist and take actions big and small across the country, and now there's even a growing movement calling for the oust of Duterte. But if you see here, as much as he's trying to keep them quiet, people are organizing and coming together to say, no, we're not having it. And so, as a Filipino American, or a Filipino here in America, it's really, I feel, from our work, is that we often take our privileges for granted, right? Like the fact that I can literally go outside and walk to my car or walk my kids to school without fear of being kidnapped or murdered, right? And so for us, I think it is our right to resist against things that we don't agree with, right? So for example, I don't want all my tax dollars or 184.5 million going to the Philippines when I know that I don't have health care here, or my kids can't get a proper education because we just can't afford it. And so I think it's up to us to really have that resistance because it's our right. And for us, solidarity for our kababayan at home, I think, is truly our duty. And so did you want to kind of do it, Sean? Did you want to do it?
Oh,
sure.
Because we're not done.
Oh, no, I thought, because we don't have access to Wi-Fi, so we can't.
Oh, I see. Okay.
That's why I was.
But I guess, so the rest of the forum is going to be structured, like, we're going to do a little quick cultural performance that everyone can participate in. Also, if folks have questions, we can answer those, like for this segment. And then I'm going to go into a presentation of my experience with a recent solidarity trip to the Philippines and Mindanao, specifically integrating with indigenous Lumad communities that were mentioned before, and just like a look of like what does it look like on the ground to be under martial law in Mindanao. And I know some folks, I ran into this too, like to bring up what you said, Arnel, earlier, is you know, there's family back home. They're like, we love martial law. You know, it feels safer. You know, especially in Davao.
I was there in 2017, and I can tell you I didn't have any problem.
Yeah.
I went through a checkpoint or two. I had to leave the city because our farm is an hour outside of the Davao. But I really saw, I mean, I was out to 11 to 2 o'clock in the mornings plenty of times, no problems.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it just depends on where you are within Mindanao. I think that's more
Exactly.
the import of the martial law. Also, I think you guys aren't mentioning like the governing group. At one point in time, Mindanao was trying to secede from the Philippines.
Mm-hmm.
So part of that is a political issue with that kind of movement as well. So, you know, there's a lot of opposition with that. It's just hard to say without being a citizen. I mean, it's hard. We're projecting our feelings of what we have and our rights here, and I totally understand that with what people there. And my family there is not unhappy, so I don't. It's really hard to. I can totally understand what's going on. Well, this is so wrong. There needs to be something done, and I totally agree. But you know, I've also been privy. I was part of the military one time. I've seen a report, a CIA report, on all the opposition groups there. This is the ISIS, the terrorist groups that were there. It was pretty scary. I can tell you right now. It's not only that, there's also China sitting right in our own Philippine waters. And I'm also trying to be a citizen of the Philippines myself because I have to manage my family land there. So it's a difficult subject for me listening to what you're saying, but I totally do agree with that there's something that needs to be done. So,
Thank you for sharing that.
yeah.
And I think it comes down to like the haves and have-nots. Like,
Sure.
you know, a lot of the cases that we're talking about in particular are like the poorest of the poor. It's like peasant communities, farmers who have no land at all, who are fighting for their rights to their land, who are fighting for their basic rights, or indigenous communities who are fighting to stay on their land. So while some people might not experience or be targeted during martial law, this is actually what martial law is for other people. You know, and so while people do feel safe, and there's another side to that coin, is that this is happening, and a lot of people don't know, and you don't really know until you go and integrate with the communities, and you don't know until you see what it's like on the ground. And I feel very fortunate that I was able to integrate with communities who are evacuated from their ancestral lands, who have been targeted by the military, who have been raped by the military, you know, so, yeah. It's hard when you don't, you know, experience it firsthand.
I'll say one more thing too. You were talking about the NPA. I have a family who claimed asylum from the NPA who moved here before Duterte. This is way before Duterte. And they were held at gunpoint. He had to leave because he was fearing for his family's health and safety. He claimed asylum here. He still is not a citizen. So the rest of all of his family are all American citizens now. They live in D.C. matter of fact. But New People's Army was a communist group. They were known as a communist group way back when. And it sounds like the Duterte is incorporating them into that scare factor to try to scare people into thinking this is not true. So I think one of the big things is getting out the facts and making people understand what's real and what's not real. That's really what's true, what's not true. It's hard to say right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And to add to that, so when integrating with like Lumad communities, a lot of times they'll talk about how the NPA, because sometimes they're like deep in the mountains, they'll actually encounter them sometimes, and they abide by humanitarian law, that they don't occupy their schools, they don't bring weapons within proximity to the schools, but Lumad communities actually, like in those facts that we saw, the AFP has often occupied their schools as bunkhouses. They'll bring guns into the community. They'll also like tell, you know, speak to young girl. You know, there's cases, community members would tell me that they would speak to the young girls and be like, oh, do you have a boyfriend? Or like, who are you dating? Can you get me firewood? Like this and that. So,
I want to point out one more thing too. We were talking about the kids coming from way far away because they live in the mountains and getting to school. So it is a big issue there because there's very scarce resources. They always need books. I was trying to bring books to them at one point in time. But the Philippine Nurses Association here, in conjunction with my mother who lives there, we're raising money to provide a bus to bring kids from the mountain to the schools in Davao. So we've been working on this for a long time now ourselves, and she actually takes kids into her own home, Muslim or whoever, to bring them to school there. So it's definitely a big issue in terms of the school, the availability of schools, the resources for the schools, and then closing down schools. That doesn't make any sense to me. I don't understand that at all. So.
Yeah. And you've seen the roads too when you're traveling these mountains. There's no paved roads, so it's very inaccessible. And the military has also set up blockades so that no resources can get in or out of these indigenous communities that are going towards the school. A lot of solidarity trips have also been like stopped. And the purpose a lot of these solidarity trips are to see what's happening on the ground, to just be like, there are extra eyes of accountability so that we can actually gather what the facts are instead of just listening to what all the news is going on out there and to see firsthand. Are there any other questions? I know it's a lot of, it's heavy material, there's a lot condensed into one.
I'm the only one speaking
It's
here.
okay.
Are there a lot of fact-finding missions that go into the Philippines? Because it's, I mean, when I listen to NPR a lot, and I listen to BBC News, and they are always reporting on this.
Yeah.
They report on the numbers of the people who are in prison, their people, the deaths. I just don't know. I mean, when you guys go in, do you guys work with them? Like BBC? BBC is a big part of this. I know that.
Not personally, but a lot of human rights organizations on the ground, international bodies have also partaken in these fact-finding missions. There was also a recent International People's Tribunal where these victims of the human rights violations testified firsthand in Brussels with the whole international law body. So if folks want more resources to that, there's the findings, the testimonies, there's also the verdict that was released. Yeah, so they happen pretty frequently, and a lot of times, I'll talk about mine soon, but ones that specifically just cover Philippine organizations have also been targeted. There's been a human rights defender named Melissa Badayo. She was also killed after participating in a fact-finding mission. There's a lot of propaganda, so like you said earlier, conflating the Communist Party of the Philippines, conflating the New People's Army with everyday activists and peasants who are fighting for their land or indigenous communities, this ends up deadly because it makes it all one blanket target. And that's why martial law is so dangerous, and why we also have to be really aware of what's happening, because it could be setting up the page for nationwide martial law.